the AI talk show where we discuss the news, share insights, bring guests from the industry, take questions, and involve you in the conversation. AI is having an impact on our businesses, our lives, our society, and everything around us. As a leader in the industry, it's our responsibility to jump in and take a part in the discussion. So let's start the conversation. I'm your host, Asha Saxena, CEO, Women Leaders in Data and AI. In today's episode, we will be discussing generative AI that everybody's been talking about, but also importantly, ethical, responsible AI. Generative AI has been one of the most popular and talked about controversial topic in the news, and it's been on people's mind. Every conference I go to, or every conversation I'm having these days, people are always talking about the chat GPT, or how can they actually use generative AI? How can they actually engage chat GPT in their own conversation? The hopes and fears about generative AI are real. AI is becoming even more life-changing for society, including people who may never even understand the impact. And for that reason, ethical concerns are important in AI discussion. How do we ensure that generative AI, and in fact, all AI-related tools and applications are ethically responsible? How could they do the most good for the most people and do the least harm to the most people? There are several areas of concerns where it comes to ethically responsible AI. It includes privacy, censorship, all flavor of biases, plagiarism, and the spread of disinformation and polarization, as well as when we think about nationalism at country level. This is truly a concern. No technology is value neutral. In fact, when we were talking about all technology is developed by the value-informed choices of designers, developers, and users, as well as the companies that employ them. So what really happens is that these technologies are really getting the competing point of view. So when we all might agree that AI technology should be ethical, exactly what those ethical choices really can be, and how can they really greatly impact the people who are making the decision. To discuss generative AI and ethical, responsible AI, we have my friend, Seth Dobrin, past Chief AI Officer of IBM. Seth, welcome to the AI Talk Show.
Thanks, Asha. Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Good to see you.
It's always good to see you. And anytime I'm talking about AI or really discussing the impact of AI, I think a lot of the conversation now, and I'm sure you feeling the same, is that people are concerned about not only the application of AI, but the impact it can have. You know, I was in Switzerland a few months back, and I got a chance to visit the Albert Einstein home. And one of the things that one of the pictures had said that Albert Einstein actually questioned the letter he wrote to Roosevelt about the Manhattan Project. And I got to see the movie Oppenheimer the past weekend. And the movie really made me think, because when you think about technology and the brilliant minds who work on the technology, it becomes responsibility of these minds of how we engage with the technology. The technology has good and bad both. And when you think about the impact of the technology, especially when I was watching the movie, it really made me sit and think about the power of the scientists and the brilliant minds who are developing it, but also the regulation of how the countries or the governments get involved in these technologies and how they can regulate or implement these technologies. So I want to start with just what are your thoughts about technology in general, but also the impact this technology can have? A powerful technology like AI, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Oppenheimer, I haven't seen the movie yet, but going back to nuclear energy, right, or nuclear in general, every transformative technology is a dual-use technology. Nuclear is a great example of that, right? It was developed initially. All the scientists did not develop it for warfare; they developed it for a new energy source. But then others saw the potential of it for having being weaponized, and that actually led to something that I think we're not really having the right level of conversation about today. Everyone's talking about AI taking over the world, making humans extinct. Before then, we have a much bigger problem. If you let's look at what happened with nuclear energy and eventually nuclear warfare. We started talking about first, second, and third world countries, right? First world countries were the US and Russia, or the USSR. Second world countries were those in our spheres. And third world countries were everyone else. Today, we've moved past that notion of first and second world country, and we think of the digital divide being essentially north and south of the equator. And we saw this with the advent of the internet and even cell phones, where those of us lucky enough to have been born or reside north of the equator get much more benefit from these technologies than those south of the equator. And overgeneralizing a little bit, but not much. And even inside countries, we see disparities in access to these technologies. And AI as a tool has the potential, and likely, if we don't intentionally make sure it doesn't happen, will likely increase the divide both inside of societies and across societies, which I think is going to potentially can lead to significant strife, amplify some of the nationalism that you're talking about, create disparities for people who don't have access to this technology, or even this technology is not being developed for. If we look at most of these generative AI technologies, some of the ones you called out at the beginning, like ChatGPT, initially those had no concept of any language that wasn't English, French, Spanish, or some other European language, or actually Latin-based or Saxon-based language. And so, that in and of itself is a problem, let alone that we're trying to impose our own cultures and things like that. I mean, I think there's just this whole conversation that's not being had about how this can potentially increase disparities to the point where it makes the world unsafe.
You bring about a really interesting point about the divide, north and south, the divide between the economic status of people around the world. I agree with you. The digital footprint has really made the world smaller, where everybody has access to the technology, but the fact that it can actually divide the world, and the organizations who are actually deploying this and creating these technologies for the use of public, the B2C organizations, if you think about beauty brands, where you could try a makeup, in the virtual setting and know if this is the right color for you, to, the kind of product you want to purchase. A lot of the organizations are now creating technologies that use AI in different format. But when we're building these technologies or these AI application, the fact that the ethical issues remain solid, even though AI and ML technologies have improved and they are creating technologies that can identify these issues, but organizations still need to have some kind of framework. You were engaged with responsible AI. You've been the chief AI officer for IBM. What do you see? Where does the AI governance helps organization define policies, or how long should they go in to really think about the building the trust or fairness or inclusivity or transparency we talk about in the AI governance? Can you talk about what have you seen where organizations are using these ethical frameworks for AI governance, and what specifically they would have to think about the data and building models and the divide you were talking about, and making sure that this divide doesn't increase and doesn't create the issues which you spoke about?
Yeah, so there's actually two parallel conversations here. So one is about these transformative technologies that we talk about as generative AI. So think ChatGPT and anything like that. Those are very, very large models that are essentially trained on the whole of the internet or similarly large data sources. And so how we govern or how we regulate those is actually a separate conversation from how we should regulate, at least in my mind, how we should regulate organizations that are using AI. And the reason for that is these underlying technologies are basically transfer. They're what's called transfer learning. So you basically teach on one topic or all topics, and you transfer it to your domain. And there's going to be things that are baked into that. So back to my comment about language, right? If you're in Kenya and ChatGPT is not trained on your dialect, you would have to retrain that model all over again. It wouldn't at a base have English or Spanish or the Kenyan equivalent of that baked into it. And so that model becomes useless for you. The other thing is, when we think about ethics, we need to be very careful about imposing our ethical construct on these organizations that are building these tools globally, because we don't necessarily want to impose our ethos on others in the world in that way. It's not the right way to. If you want to change the politics of a country, you do it through political channels. You don't do it through technological channels. That's almost akin to warfare of a certain kind, if you will, in my mind. And so we need to be very careful, even thinking about things like bias. The construct of bias is different in the US and Canada and Europe and the UK than it is in, say, Asia or Africa or the Middle East. And so we should not impose our perspectives of biases, so our cultural perspectives of biases, on the rest of the world when they're being built into this model. So that's one whole separate conversation that I think needs to be had. But the conversation that I think you were going for was more, how do organizations look at this internally? And when I'm in a company and I'm doing this, like we're essentially doing, in the case of IBM or any company that's selling any AI enabled software, you're basically either you're buying AI, you're building AI, or you're selling AI. And selling AI is built on top of your building AI, if you will. And so you need to have a framework for how you're going to procure AI. So what are the terms in your contracts that are going to protect you? What are the requirements that you have specific for that software or technology that's enabled by AI? You need to think about, like, how was the data collected? So is it compliant with GDPR or CCPA or other regulations? So you need to get that attestation or certification from the company you're buying it from, because you don't want to inherit that problem. At the very least, I'm not a lawyer, but you want them to indemnify against you against any risk. So that's one whole conversation. You need to have a procurement process that's well defined, that's very transparent, so your vendors come in and they can be prepared. So that's one part. So when you're building AI, it's probably a combination of some procurement processes you're doing and some internal capabilities. And when you say the word governance in an organization, people usually cringe and they think of it as a roadblock. But my experience over the last 15 or so years with governance, whether it's data or AI or whatever, is that when it's done right and it's very clear and transparent and there's an escalation process that's rapid, it actually is enabling. So you are now providing guardrails for the organization and saying, you can innovate all you want as long as you stay in these two lanes. As soon as you start touching one of these lanes, you need to have a conversation, and you're absolutely not allowed to go outside of these lanes, right? And so having that clarity of mission for the whole organization focuses all of that innovation on the right message. But to do that, you need to have a stance about the company, about what they're doing, in this case, about AI. It needs to be very loud internally and externally. And the body that you put in charge of governing it needs to have teeth, meaning that if they say something shouldn't be done, end a conversation. They say it shouldn't have been done. IBM did a great job of this. Christina Montgomery set up the AI ethics board there. And that is highly effective, provides the right level of clarity, the right level of governance. There's an escalation process. And during my experience, I've never seen, and I was part of the board, I've never seen any conversation we had get overridden by anyone else outside of that body. And so it was a very meaningful and impactful way to do that. And that led to some of the conversations you see IBM having about, IBM's not going to participate in general purpose facial recognition or other, biometric type information. So that's the kind of stance they take, that the company stands behind. And so it's really, really important that companies across the board do that.
I love that. What you said is that not just to show, but ethics has to have the power to really execute, not just because you're, checking a box, but truly have equity in when you build the department or the function, and make sure that the organization invests in giving the power to the department if they create one. I love the two parallel paths you spoke about. One is the organization and one is large language model. And when you think about generative AI, but before we talk about regulation, there is so much conversation about generative AI and business unit. This is the first time ever. I mean, I've been in the business for 30 years, and I feel like this is the first time when businesses are knocking on the IT door and saying, I want to use generative AI, and how can I actually create an application that we can use. So before we jump into regulation again, I want to talk about generative AI, the large language models, and why there is such a hype about the large language models now than ever before. And also the use cases, if you've seen some use cases which are truly value add, where you feel excited about those use cases.
Yeah, so I think this is really good. I think it's good to level set on terminology a little bit too, right? Everyone has heard of large language models such as ChatGPT. Large language models are a type of generative AI. So DALL-E is not a large language model, but it's generative AI. Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, those are vision-based generative AI or image-based generative AI. And generative AI models are essentially, they're what are called transformer models, which you can go Google. Google invented this technology or coined the term a long time ago. And those are a type of something called a foundation model or foundational model. And let's talk about the base, so foundational models overall, because I think everything we're talking about with language models today applies to this concept of foundational models in general. And so what foundational models are is they're models that are pre-trained on a significant corpus of data. For language and vision, what we've seen is the whole of the internet, right, for the most part. And that causes some issues that we can have a whole nother conversation about. But there are other ways to do this as well. So you can yourself train a foundational model internally to your organization based on your company's data. So for instance, let's make the leap back to where the conversation started about large language models. If I wanted to build a large language model for company XYZ, I would pull in all of the documents I have. I would need to process those into what essentially amounts to a set of question answer pairs, right? So what a conversation would look like. Asha, you're asking me a question, I answer, but you do this for all of your textual or document data or basically non-media based unstructured data you have in the organization. And you could train a model on this corpus of data. And then, a few $1 million later, you would have a large language model for your company. And so again, a foundation model for your company. Now, there's another way to do this, which is to start with one of the existing foundation models. So for instance, OpenAI, which is GPT-4, is a proprietary one. There's lots of open source ones like Bloom or Falcon. So let's just say I'm a company and I want to build my own. Instead of training everything from scratch, I would go grab an open source model. Let's say I'll go take Bloom. Which is on huggingface.com. And I'm going to put all my corpus of data in that. Instead of retraining from scratch, I'm going to fine tune that model. So take all the learnings that they got from training that model, and I'm going to fine tune it based on my data. And I think this last one that I just went through is what you're going to see a lot of companies start to do. They're going to start building not just company specific large language models or generative AI models or foundation models, but domain specific ones. So that you would have within a company, let's just pick Chevron, like Chevron may have 40 different of these generative AI models serving different purposes across the whole company, right? And so, I think that's really how this technology is going to start being used. So we'll take these commercially or open source developments. Now, I want to call out one thing. The reason I said Bloom, I picked that as my open source model because there was a paper that was done from some guys and a group of people in Stanford. I shouldn't say guys because it was men and women, but a group of people at Stanford who assessed the compliance of these various models, open source and closed source, with the upcoming EU AI Act. And Bloom scored better than any others. And so if I were in a corporation, I wouldn't start with any others except for that, because that would give me the highest level of confidence that I'm not off the bat getting myself into trouble. So I think we need to start looking at that. I mentioned about procuring AI. You're procuring stuff when you're using open source too. Not necessarily writing a check for it, but you're bringing it in from outside the organization. You need to take the same level of care when you're doing that as if you were buying something.
I love, first of all, thank you for explaining for the audience who doesn't understand the importance of foundation models, large language models, and generative AI applications. And I think the fact that now you have access to these models you can build upon those, or continue evolving from those becomes really a benefit for either professionals or organizations to tap into. Now I want to go back to what you were talking about, the two parallel path of organizations' responsibility, but also the large language model, the countries and the biases between what really, how you define biases. I love that each region, each culture have different biases. What I think is not a bias, you may see it as a bias. So I like that perspective a lot. And in our last show, we were talking about AI regulation, and we really spoke about the governments. We spoke about how we see government, both local, state, federal, even international organization like EU, striving to put regulations in place to govern development and also use of application. And I think your point is really interesting, because as the countries get involved in figuring out what the regulation should be and what the biases and how do you control biases would be really interesting, especially when you're thinking about large international organizations with different countries and cultures of distribution, and even the customer base, how the customer base sees, what the trends are, what the colors are of what they're buying a retail product. So now when you think about that, and as these are coming together, developing AI application or using AI tools for developing applications or running their operations within the organization can really come across different rules, as you spoke about. So when you're thinking about the legal and regulatory frameworks that need to be in the place of, on the larger scale of development for responsible AI, what do you see, and where do you see these regulations should be focusing on, and how do you really look at that different countries and international organization applying those?
Yeah, so I think when we look at, again, these foundation models aside, when you look at regulating AI, I think it's really important to regulate the use case. So what is the application I'm going to be using this AI for? And that's important because one of the things that I've been advocating for a long time is that when you do an AI project, you need to take a human-centered approach. And by that, I don't mean make it UX, UI, make it pretty. I mean, you need to start by the humans that are using the AI and the humans that are impacted by the AI. And they may or may not be the same person. So for example, if I'm on Amazon and I'm shopping and Amazon gives me a spurious recommendation, I'm both the user and I'm the person that's impacted, right? But if I'm applying for a mortgage and the mortgage broker or the underwriter is using AI, and she uses that AI to make a decision, that decision impacts me, not her, right? And so you need to understand who are the humans that are involved, what do they care about? And that gets to the conversation about different perspectives of bias. So if I'm a multinational company and I'm building an AI application or an AI-enabled application, I may have different controls over that, or I would want to have different controls over that as it's being deployed in different locations. And in fact, if you have different definitions of biases, you probably need to have different versions of that model so that you've accounted for mitigating that bias as best you can and controlling it in that output. And so when we get to regulation needs regulators, again, foundation models aside, regulators need to regulate the outcome. And the EU has done a really good job of doing this, whether or not you agree with their structures or what is high risk or not, or no risk, or, they've done a really good job of saying, we're going to regulate outcomes. And essentially anything that directly impacts the health, wealth, or livelihood of a human is a high risk use case. I think it'd be hard to argue with that, right? And so then when you're implementing that in the EU, they've also made a specific call out that is very, very important. With every other regulation that I know of in the space of data and AI, it's been very ambiguous as to how, whether or not if you can comply with these regulations. If you're ready. They specifically called out ISO standards. So if you look at the EU AI Act, they reference, they say something, I'm not going to paraphrase a lot because I'm not an attorney or a policy person, but if you use the ISO/EEC or NIST in the US standard for AI, you are likely to comply with this regulation. Now, those standards need to be configured so that they're, used for specific use cases, but you need to essentially run a conformity assessment against these standards, and that helps you assess whether you're ready for them. And you'll have different conformity assessments for every every type of use case. So for hiring, for lending, for healthcare, you'd have different same conformity assessment, but configured differently for each of those. And so you need to regulate the use case. You need to be able to measure that. Are you aligning with those use cases? And in fact, this is what the Responsible AI Institute does. They build these conformity assessments. And you see them being used pretty widely for highly regulated as well as completely non-regulated industries, so that people know, are they following their own internal guidelines and standards? So I think I answered your question.
Yes, you did. And you know what makes me think is that you're talking about really regulation at different levels. We spoke about briefly on the government, federal government coming in and having regulations, and we spoke about EU, and of course, all different regions will get involved in regulations, and I love that Prime Minister from UK came to Washington D.C. and spoke about or committing to having the global AI summit and really hosting that, because they truly believe that this is an important cause. So I like the fact that you're all coming together at the level of all the countries and the regions working together on this. But we also have the responsibility, and we spoke about the organization taking steps from different functional area, having a center of excellence where ethics and responsible AI has the equity and power to execute and regulate what's been developed. I want to talk about personal responsibility as a professional. As we are evolving from artificial ANI to general intelligence to AGI to super intelligence, the ASI. So from narrow intelligence to general intelligence to super intelligence, the fear is that the computers are going to get more powerful and strong, and they're going to have the mind of their own. We are still in the narrow intelligence. We're still at the world where we are still at the machine learning stage. When we move from machine learning to intelligence, and intelligence to having consciousness, where is the responsibility of me as a person, as a human who's engaging with AI, or you are a developer or creator of AI? Where does the regulation or the self-governance comes in play?
Yeah, so there's so many really good conversations in there. So first of all, what does intelligence mean, right? So how do you define when an AI has crossed the line into intelligence? Has it already? Is mimicking behavior and being able to reason, which these technologies we have today can do, is that human level intelligence? Because humans can do that. They may not have emotion, but they can certainly mimic emotion. And so I think there's a whole conversation about what is general intelligence, what is super intelligence, where are the boundaries between where we are today and those, if we're not already at one of them. In terms of personal accountability, I think we all need to be able to go home and sleep at night, right? I mean, through my time at IBM, there's some projects that I was asked to work on that, that IBM was in the same position as me, so it didn't really matter. But, if I was asked to work on a project that I didn't agree with how AI was being used, even if I knew it had to be done. So let's take national security, right? So I am not a supporter at all of just complete mass surveillance using facial recognition, right? I think it should be, I think it should be allowed. However, national security organizations need to do that. They need to do that to keep us safe. So I will not participate in that, but at the same time, I'm not going to tell them they shouldn't do that. I'm not going to belittle them for doing that, because they need to do it, right? Predator drones need to be able to tell you're Asha and I'm Seth. Do I want to participate in that? No. Will I ever participate in that? No. But it needs to happen. And so you need to have, just like guardrails help a company, innovate within boundaries. I think as individual technologists, or even as individual business users of this technology, we all need to have our own guardrails, and we need to stick to them. And when we start getting pushed up against them, we need to evaluate one of two things. We need to evaluate, do we have the right guardrails if I'm even thinking about going out of them? Or, is this something that I'm worth doing? Is so incredibly valuable to me that is worth going outside of my guardrail? So for instance, I've stated I will never work for one or two companies in the world. Right? I will never work for them. I don't care how much money they offer me. I don't care anything. It's not worth me not being able to go home and feel good about myself or what I do at night. So same thing, I think, just, we need that kind of level of maturity in ourselves as technology leaders, and level of ethos. And then the other thing is, I think what we're doing with AI and with technology in general today is very much akin to the medical profession, where you can do a lot of really good if you're a surgeon, or you can very, efficiently kill someone, right? And so, the medical profession has the Hippocratic Oath. We need a Hippocratic Oath for AI technology, where every technologist, somehow signs on and says they're going to do it. And then, even so far as to, companies may eventually declare, I'm not going to work with anyone who hasn't, I'm not going to hire anyone who hasn't signed this, And so, I think it needs to be that far, just like, if a doctor says, I'm not going to adhere to the Hippocratic Oath, no one's going to hire him.
Right.
Right. Or if they've been demonstrated not to, which is how people get their licenses taken away, because they've used medicine to hurt people or to do things that are outside of their, first do no harm principle. And so we need a similar first do no harm for AI and what that means.
I love what you said about being really ethical and responsible as your own value system, your own core. I was at a conference and I was at a coffee station. I was talking to some younger professionals, and I was talking to them they were talking about ChatGPT and how excited they were, and they were talking about if it's good or bad. And I said, if you're engaging with AI, you're doing reinforcement learning. So if you say, oh, the model is stupid, or you're using a negative connotation, it's going to repeat or enhance that. So how you engage with AI and how you develop AI, it depends really upon your ethical code of conduct. And I love your oath idea about really before you even start being responsible. AI is not engaging with AI or developing AI is a responsibility. And as professional, data professional or AI professionals, it's important that we take that seriously. I love having a conversation with you about AI always. As a last question, I want to know, what do you worry about? You've been in the field, you are in the center of the chaos. What are you worried about, and what are you excited about, just as a closing statement?
Yeah, so the thing I'm worried about is where we started, right? I think we're having the wrong conversation about the challenges of AI. The challenge of AI is not, killer robots. The challenge of AI is not, humans are going to become extinct because of AI. It will be eventually, but we have a much closer challenge that we need to deal with, which is, that's akin to not saying we're not going to reduce carbon emissions. We're just going to deal with the impact of global warming or climate change, right? We have that choice today. Are we just going to deal with the impact of AI, which is, all these, horrible things you hear about, or are we going to make sure AI is used in a way that's productive for society, which will help keep us away from that? So making sure we don't enhance the disparity that's within each society and across the north and south of the equator. So we need to make sure that AI is inclusive to everyone, not just to those of us in power, or in this case, developing this technology. So that's one thing. The other thing is regulators are way too slow to keep up with this technology. Even as technologists, it's impossible. This field changes weekly. It's impossible to keep up. And so we need policy bodies like the FDA or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or the EPA or the, any other country's version or region's version of those. We need one for AI that is empowered by the legislative body of each of those countries or jurisdictions to make policies, much like you see with medicine, much like you see with nuclear or just energy in general, much like you see with any other highly technical field. We need that same kind of, expert governed, expert led policy, and not someone who, doesn't know this technology or doesn't care to know it. Even worse, which most of our politicians fall into that. So those are the two things. You asked me for one, but I'm going to give you two because they're both related to a certain extent, I think. What am I most excited about? if we use this technology right, it actually has the opportunity to help us reduce some of the inequities that live in this world. Because if we can systematically, on a society by society basis, rule out those things that we don't think should be happening in society, like bias, that can make the world a better place. It can make the world a more inclusive place, and it can help us live better, more effective lives. And this technology, if we have that as a first principle, this technology can actually help us do our jobs better, can help us be more efficient, can help us do more value-added work. And if you even look at where some of these early use cases are in generative AI, they're replacing work that no one wants to do, right? Like, people in information security groups don't want to be on the phone with you when you click on a phishing email, right? They don't want to be responding to those things. They would rather, how can we automate that? And so that's one place where I've seen this technology being used as, let's just eliminate people who don't want to do this work. And there's lots of other opportunities out there for similar type, not even low value, that's high value work, but no one wants to do it.
First of all, thank you for joining us. Every time I speak to you, I feel like I get to learn something new. But really important, which I think you speak about, is I love the thought about just bringing your core values, being ethical, being a good human, doing the right thing as we are developing and creating. So I think the audience are the technical leaders, and these leaders need to take responsibility of what they're creating and developing, and how they're engaging is really important. It's important that we have regulations from the government, we have regulations from the organizations, but it's really important that each one of us takes the responsibility.
Yeah.
As you said, AI has a lot of power to do good, create efficiency, make our life easier. I'm so excited about the possibility of healthcare, the living long but living well. All that is possible through AI. How we create learning and in academia, how we use AI to create learning path that interest us is really possible by having AI. So there's a lot of possibilities of doing good using AI. But the question is, are we going to be responsible and be ethical as we create the guardrails and follow the guardrails? And I also love having the oath. Make sure that when you commit to developing and creating and being engaged in AI, can you take the oath to do the right thing? Lots of really great inputs and thoughts here. We keep having these discussions, and I think it's, as Seth, you said, it's so changing so fast, and we're developing so many applications. And no matter which business you are in, you can now use AI. It's not a question of having a large infrastructure or creating tons of investments in building. You have models available which you can very quickly jump in and start engaging with it. Our kids are using ChatGPT at home. We have agencies who are using Midjourney and technologies like that to create animations and graphics. There's a lot of applications which are using APIs to connect with different models and use. So we'll continue our discussion. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We look forward to bringing you more thought-provoking discussions, cutting-edge news, and expert insight in our next episode. Please go to the LinkedIn and subscribe and follow. As well, check out the links and resources in the show notes. We usually share all the important information. And please share your comments, feedbacks. If you enjoyed the episode, share it with others, leave a review, and thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Asha Saxena, and this is the AI Talk Show. See you next time. Thank you.